My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm 64 years old, and until 11 months ago, I never imagined I'd be sitting alone in a house built for a family of 6, guarding a secret worth $44 million. Mom, we need to talk about the money situation. Derek says it's not fair that you're just sitting on it. That was the text my daughter sent me at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after her wedding. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the maple tree my husband, Walter, had planted the year our daughter was born. I didn't reply right away. I wanted to. My thumbs hovered over the screen for a long moment. But something in me, the same something that had kept me quiet for 11 months, told me to wait. Before I tell you what happened when Derek showed up at my door with a lawyer 3 days later, let me know where you're watching from, and if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see how far they were willing to go and what I did about it. Walter and I were married for 39 years before his heart gave out in his sleep, quietly, the way he did most things. Most people in town knew him as the man who ran Whitfield Freight, a trucking company he built out of a single secondhand rig he bought at 26. Few people knew what that single truck had grown into by the time he sold the company 4 years before he died. He started with nothing. His father drove trucks for someone else his whole life and never owned so much as a hubcap free and clear. Walter used to say that watching his dad hand over half his life's earnings to a company that didn't care about him was the thing that lit the fire in his belly. He dropped out of community college after 2 semesters, borrowed money from an uncle for a down payment on a used truck, and started hauling freight up and down the interstate himself, sleeping in the cab more nights than not. I met him when I was 23, working the counter at a diner off Route 9 where truckers stopped for coffee at all hours. He came in every Thursday for almost 2 months before he worked up the nerve to ask for my number instead of just a refill. "You drive that big rig, but you're scared of a waitress," I told him. He laughed so hard, he nearly choked on his eggs. We were married 10 months later in my mother's backyard, with folding chairs borrowed from the church. For the first 15 years, it was just the 2 of us and that truck, then 2 trucks, then a small dispatch office above a tire shop. We lived in a rented duplex, drove cars with rolled-down windows because the AC never worked, and put every spare dollar back into the business. The company grows or we don't, Walter used to say. There's no in-between. By the time our daughter, Grace, was born, he had 11 trucks and 3 drivers besides himself. By the time she started high school, Whitfield Freight had 92 trucks running regional routes across 4 states. We never flaunted it. We stayed in the same modest house we bought when Grace was a baby, the one with a maple tree out front. We drove practical cars. We took 1 real vacation a year, usually camping because Walter said money spent on show was money wasted, and money invested quietly was money that worked for you while you slept. Grace grew up understanding what hard work looked like, but she never knew the true scope of what her father had built. That was intentional. Walter wanted her to make her own way, to know the satisfaction of earning something rather than being handed it. She went into nursing, which made him prouder than any inheritance could have. She's building something real with her own 2 hands, he told me once, watching her study for board exams at our kitchen table. That's worth more than any number I could leave her. 3 years before he died, a national logistics company approached Walter with an offer to buy Whitfield Freight outright. After months of back and forth, he sold for $41 million. He rolled most of it into conservative investments, real estate, and a diversified portfolio managed by an old friend from his Rotary Club who happened to also be a financial advisor. He wanted it to keep growing quietly, the way the company always had. Then, 18 months ago, a stroke took him from us in under 6 hours. There was no long illness, no time to prepare, no last conversations stretched out over months. One evening he complained his arm felt strange. By morning he was gone. His final words to me, spoken in a hospital hallway while we waited for a doctor who never came in time, were simple. Take care of Gracie, but don't let her lean on money instead of her own legs. After the funeral, when the estate was finally settled, I learned the full number for the first time myself. Between the sale of the company, the investment portfolio, the life insurance, and the properties we'd quietly accumulated over the years, I inherited just over $44 million. Grace received a trust that would mature on her 40th birthday, 11 years away, worth $2 million, structured carefully by Walter's attorney so that the bulk of the estate would remain under my sole control until I decided otherwise. The grief in those first months nearly swallowed me. I slept on Walter's side of the bed because it still smelled like him. I found myself talking to him in the garage, where his tools still hung exactly where he'd left them. Grace was the one who kept me tethered to the world. She came by twice a week, called every single day, sat with me through the worst of it without once asking about money. For almost a year, I barely thought about the number sitting in those accounts. I was too busy learning how to be a person without my husband beside me. Grace had always been careful with relationships. A few boyfriends over the years, nothing that stuck. At 31, she seemed content, busy with her patients, close with her small circle of nursing school friends, in no particular hurry. I sometimes worried she'd end up lonely, but Walter and I had raised her to make her own choices, and I trusted that. Then, 8 months ago, everything changed. She met a man named Derek Pruitt at a hospital charity gala, the kind of black-tie fundraiser her hospital threw once a year to court donors. The way she described that night, it sounded like something out of a movie. He was standing by the bar, Mom, and he had this way of looking at me like nobody else in the room existed. Within 10 days, they were exclusive. She brought him to Sunday dinner 3 weeks after they met. I still remember the sound of Derek's shoes on my hardwood floor, expensive leather, the kind that clicks. He walked in wearing a watch that looked like it cost more than my first car, and before he'd even taken off his jacket, his eyes swept the living room like he was pricing the furniture. "Beautiful place," he said. "Grace mentioned your husband ran some kind of trucking outfit?" "He built a freight company," I said. "Started with one truck. And he sold it before he passed, didn't he?" Derek pressed, settling onto my couch without being asked. "Must have been a nice payday." Grace laughed nervously and changed the subject to the appetizers. But that question stuck to me the rest of the night, the way a burr sticks to a sock. It wasn't curiosity. It was appraisal. Later, while Grace and I did dishes and Derek said he needed the bathroom, he was gone nearly 15 minutes. When I went upstairs afterward, I found the door to Walter's old study cracked open, a door I always kept shut. Nothing looked disturbed, but nothing ever needs to look disturbed for you to know someone's been somewhere they shouldn't. Walter used to tell me, "Your gut knows things before your head catches up, Elle." That night, my gut was ringing like a fire bell. But Grace looked happier than I'd seen her in years, so I folded my concerns up small and put them away, the way you do when you love someone more than you trust your own instincts. Their relationship moved at a pace that left me breathless. Within 6 weeks, Derek had moved into Grace's apartment. Grace, who had once told me she'd never live with a man before marriage, who liked her space, who took 2 years to even introduce me to a boyfriend before Derek. "When it's right, Mom," she said, echoing something that sounded rehearsed rather than felt. Her spending changed too. My daughter, who clipped coupons out of habit and drove the same reliable sedan for 9 years, was suddenly carrying a designer handbag and talking about trading in her car for something more fitting. When I asked, she brushed it off. "Derek says I've been too hard on myself for too long. I deserve nice things." At a dinner Derek insisted on paying for, at a restaurant where the wine alone cost more than my weekly grocery bill, he steered the conversation toward finances with the subtlety of a bulldozer. "Grace mentioned your husband's company did pretty well before he sold it. Freight's a good business to be in these days. Bet that sale set you up nicely." "Walter was careful with money," I said. "He made sure I'd be fine." "Fine like comfortable, or fine like," he smiled, swirling his glass, "fine like you never have to think about a number again?" I told him I'd never been one for financial details. It was a lie. Walter had spent years making sure I understood every account, every investment, every decision, precisely so I'd never be at anyone's mercy. But something told me Derek didn't need to know that. After that dinner, a pattern set in. Grace's calls grew shorter, further apart. Our standing Sunday dinners became, we'll try to make it dinners, then dinners that didn't happen at all. When we did talk, Derek was often in the background, and I began to notice Grace choosing her words carefully, like she was performing for an audience only she could see. 3 months into their relationship, Grace canceled our annual visit to Walter's grave on what would have been his 68th birthday, a tradition we'd kept together every year without fail. When I called that evening, hurt and confused, Derek answered her phone. "She's in the shower," he said breezily. "We had a work thing come up, sorry about that. I'm sure your husband would understand. Gotta keep the career moving, right?" Hearing this stranger invoke Walter's memory so casually felt like a slap. When Grace called back the next morning, her apology sounded like it had been written for her. Worried and increasingly shut out, I called my oldest friend, Patricia, for lunch. She was one of the few people who knew the real size of what Walter had left me. "Something's wrong with this one, Pat," I told her. "He asks about money the way other men ask about the weather. Constant. Casual. Always circling back." "What have you told him?" she asked. "Nothing specific. Walter always said, keep your cards close until you know who you're playing with." "Smart man," Patricia said. "Stay smart now." My caution proved justified 5 months after they met, when Grace called with news that hit me like a gust of cold air. "Mom, we're engaged," he asked last night. Her voice carried excitement, but underneath it, something brittle. I forced warmth into my own voice. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Have you set a date?" "Actually, yes. 6 weeks from now." "Small and intimate," Derek says. 6 weeks. I nearly dropped the phone. "When it's right, why wait?" she said, that same rehearsed cadence again. Then came the part I'd been bracing for without knowing it. "Mom, I was actually hoping we could talk about you helping with some of the costs. Nursing doesn't pay what people think, and Derek wants everything to be really special." It was the first time in her adult life Grace had asked me for money beyond a birthday check. Walter, and I raised her to stand on her own. "Of course," I said carefully. "Come by this weekend, and we'll talk numbers." After I hung up, I sat in Walter's study, looking at the photo of him on the desk, laughing at something just out of frame. "What do I do, Walt?" I whispered. I could almost hear him answer. "Protect our girl, Elle. But let her make her own mistakes, too." The question that kept me up that night was whether this particular mistake would cost her more than a broken heart. What Grace called a few costs turned into something else entirely once Derek got involved. The small, intimate ceremony ballooned into a 200-guest affair at the Ashford Grand, the most expensive venue in the county. When they sat at my kitchen table with a spreadsheet, the total came to $84,000, designer gown, custom tuxedo, imported flowers, a photographer who normally shot celebrity weddings, top shelf everything. "We only do this once," Derek said, sliding the spreadsheet toward me like he was closing a business deal. I looked at Grace. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "I can contribute $25,000, I said, watching Derek's easy smile falter for just a second. "That's generous, and it's final. Traditionally, the bride's family covers more," he said. "And given your situation—" "My situation," I said evenly, "is that Walter believed in living within your means. $25,000 is my contribution. You'll need to adjust the plans." That night, a text came from Grace. "Derek's upset. He says most moms in your position would do more. Can we talk about increasing it?" That confirmed what I'd started to suspect. Derek believed I was sitting on a fortune, and he intended to find out exactly how large it was, and how much of it he could get his hands on. The night before the final venue walkthrough, I arrived early and heard Derek's voice drifting from the hotel's side hallway. He was on the phone, and something in his tone, low, gleeful, careless of who might hear, made me stop walking. "Yeah, everything's moving exactly like I said. Grace still has no idea what her mom's actually sitting on. Old lady plays it real modest, but the freight company sold for over $40 million, easy. Once we're married, I start working the angle slow. She can't exactly take it with her." I stood frozen against the wall, my hand pressed flat to my chest like I could hold my heart in place. Then I turned and walked back to my car before he could see me, my hands trembling too hard to fit the key in the ignition at first. The next morning, I called Raymond, Walter's old attorney, and told him everything. "I need to protect what Walter built," I said. "My daughter is marrying a man who sees her as a doorway to money, and I don't know how far he's willing to go once that door is open." Raymond didn't sound surprised. Unfortunately, this happens more than people think when there's real wealth in a family. Has Grace ever been told the full number?
No.
We always wanted her to build her own life without that weight on her. "That instinct may have just saved you both," he said. "Let's make sure everything is airtight before the wedding, not after." We spent 3 hours going through trusts, updating the estate plan, adding protective language that would shield Grace's eventual inheritance even in the event of a divorce, because in most states, a new spouse has no automatic claim to a parent's assets. But once inherited money gets mixed into a marriage, things get complicated fast. Raymond also helped me write a letter, one to be given to Grace only if something happened to me, explaining everything, the wealth, the choices, the reasons for the silence. I left his office that day carrying a strange mixture of relief and grief. I was protecting Walter's legacy, but I was also keeping the biggest secret of my life from my only child during what should have been the happiest season of hers. The wedding itself was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, glittering, loud, and slightly hollow. Grace looked stunning walking down the aisle, though I noticed the tightness around her eyes, the same tightness I remembered from nights before big nursing exams. Derek looked triumphant more than he looked in love. At the reception, I sat beside Derek's parents, a quiet, unassuming couple clearly uncomfortable in the lavish surroundings. His mother leaned over during dinner and said, "This is all so much." Derek told us the bride's family was covering the difference, said her father left them quite comfortable. I said nothing, just nodded and sipped my water. During the toasts, Derek raised his glass and, with a smile aimed directly at me, said, "And thank you to my new mother-in-law, Eleanor, for welcoming me into a family with such security." He let the word hang in the air a beat too long. A few guests chuckled awkwardly. Grace's smile flickered. Later, slipping past the restroom hallway, I overheard Derek talking to his groomsmen. "Relax, man. This is just the beginning. Once the ring's on, I start laying the groundwork. Old lady's loaded. She just doesn't spend like it." I didn't sleep that night. 6 days later, I was in the garden pruning the roses, Walter, and I planted the year we paid off the house, when I heard tires on my gravel drive. A car I didn't recognize, sleek, black, expensive, pulled up beside my 10-year-old sedan. Derek stepped out first, dressed like he had somewhere important to be. Behind him came a man in a tailored suit carrying a leather briefcase, wearing the particular blank, professional expression I remembered from meetings with Walter's own lawyers over the years. Grace was nowhere in sight. "Derek," I said, pulling off my gardening gloves. "I thought you two were still on your honeymoon." "We came back early," he said smoothly. "This is Marcus Bell, our financial advisor. We need to talk about something important." Our financial advisor, married 8 days, and they already had one I'd never heard of. "Come in," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'll make coffee." Inside, with untouched cups cooling on the table, Marcus opened his briefcase and slid a folder toward me. "Mrs. Whitfield, it's come to our attention that you inherited approximately $44 million following your husband's passing." The exact figure landed like a stone in my stomach. I had shared that number with no one but my attorney and my financial advisor. "And how," I asked quietly, "did that come to your attention?" "Grace found some of her father's old business documents," Derek said. The sale figures were right there. I doubted very much that Grace had found anything, or that she'd have shared it if she had. This had Derek's fingerprints all over it, likely gathered during those unexplained 15-minute disappearances into rooms he had no business being in. "I see," I said. "And why does that concern the two of you today?" Marcus folded his hands. "Mrs. Whitfield, Grace is your only heir. We believe it's reasonable for her and Derek, as her husband, to access a portion of that wealth now, rather than waiting for an inheritance that could be decades off." "We're not getting any younger," Derek added, with a boldness that took my breath away. "And frankly, it feels selfish to sit on that much when it could help us get established." I studied them both, letting the anger build quietly beneath a still surface. And what exactly are you proposing? Marcus pushed the folder closer. An initial distribution of $8 million to help you establish a home, clear wedding-related debt, and build a foundation. Additionally, a monthly stipend of $20,000 while Grace considers stepping back from nursing to focus on family planning. Family planning. The implication was unmistakable. They were already dangling grandchildren as leverage. And if I decline? I asked. Derek's easy charm slipped for just a moment, replaced by something colder. Then we'd have to explore other options. Marcus mentioned that a will can be contested, especially if undue influence can be shown during an illness. Or, he added, almost gently, questions could be raised about whether a woman your age is fit to manage assets this large alone. They were threatening to call me incompetent, to imply I'd manipulated a dying man, all to get their hands on what Walter spent 30 years building with his own 2 hands. I stood up slowly. This conversation is over. I'll need you both to leave. You're making a mistake, Derek said, all pretense gone now. Grace is going to be devastated when she hears how little you actually care about her future. I doubt that, I said. In fact, I wonder if Grace even knows you're here. His eyes narrowed. Of course she does. This was her idea. The lie was so thin it was almost funny. Then I'll discuss it with her directly, I said. Until then, we have nothing further to say. As they walked to the door, Derek turned back, his voice sharp now. This isn't over, Eleanor. You can share what belongs to this family, or you can lose your daughter completely. Your choice. After they left, I sat in Walter's chair, shaking, not from fear for myself, but for Grace. If Derek was willing to go this far after 8 days of marriage, I had no idea what he'd try next, or what he might do to my daughter to get it. I called Raymond immediately. They just tried to extort $8 million from me and threatened to challenge Walter's will if I refused. Don't panic, he said. They have no legal ground. Write down everything while it's fresh. Don't speak to either of them again until we have a plan. That night, I barely slept, replaying every warning sign I'd tried to explain away. My instincts about Derek had been right from that very first dinner. Now I needed a way to reach my daughter with the truth before he buried it completely. The day after the ambush at my door, I was still shaking when the doorbell rang again. My stomach dropped, certain Derek had returned with more demands. Instead, I opened the door to find Grace standing alone on my porch, and she looked nothing like a woman on her honeymoon. Her eyes were swollen, her hair pulled back carelessly, her hands trembling at her sides. "Mom," she said, voice cracking. "Can I come in?" I pulled her inside and sat her at the kitchen table, filling the kettle out of pure habit, the way I had every time she'd come home upset since she was 7 years old. "Why aren't you still traveling?" I asked gently. "Derek said there was a work emergency." "But that's not, Mom. Something's wrong. He's been different since the wedding. Cold, almost. Like a switch flipped." I set the tea in front of her and made a decision I'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. "Grace, Derek came here yesterday with a man named Marcus Bell, who he introduced as a family financial advisor." Her face went pale. "What?" "Why would he? They demanded $8 million and a monthly stipend on top of it. They told me it was your idea." "That's not, Mom, I never." She pressed her palms to her eyes. "Oh my God. He's been acting so strange. On the flight back, he was talking about looking at multi-million-dollar properties, like it was already decided. When I said we couldn't afford anything close to that, he just laughed and said family money would handle it. My heart broke watching her put the pieces together in real time. Then I found notes on his laptop. She continued, voice shaking. Numbers. 44 million, circled. Calculations about how estate planning could be challenged after enough time passed. I told myself I was imagining it. I didn't want to believe. "Grace," I said quietly, "that number is real. Your father left me $44 million. We never told you because he wanted you to build your life without that weight sitting on you." She stared at me, stunned. I had no idea it was anywhere near that much. "We wanted you to be proud of what you built with your own hands, not defined by what you might inherit. I was proud, she said, bitterness creeping into her voice. I still am. But Derek, she pulled out her phone, hands unsteady, and showed me a string of messages between Derek and his groomsmen. Got the ring on her finger. Phase 1 done. Wife's clueless about the real number. Once assets combine, lawyer says we push for claim, easier if we wait a year or two so it looks less obvious. Old lady will fold once grandkids are on the table. Reading it, I felt a strange, hollow mixture of vindication and heartbreak. I'd been right. That brought no comfort at all, only grief for what my daughter was living through. I left this morning while he thought I was getting coffee, Grace said. I needed to know if what I suspected was true. I'm so sorry you're finding this out this way, I said, taking her hand. No, she said, straightening with something steel-like breaking through the devastation. I'm sorry I didn't trust my own gut. You were careful about him from the very first dinner. I saw it, and I explained it away. You weren't wrong to hope, I told her. You just weren't given the whole picture soon enough. That's on me too. What do we do now? She asked. First, no more secrets between us. Then, we deal with Derek, together with everything we know. We spent the afternoon going through everything, the trust Walter had set up for her, Raymond's protective legal work, the letter Walter had written years ago explaining exactly why we'd kept quiet for so long. Grace read it twice, tears sliding down silently. Dad was right, she finally said. Money really does show you who someone is. It just took Derek to prove it. We called Raymond, who came over within the hour with copies of everything from the confrontation. Together, the three of us built a plan. Given the marriage was barely 2 weeks old, an annulment based on fraud and misrepresentation was possible. There was no prenup. Derek had been oddly insistent it wasn't necessary, since we trust each other, which complicated things slightly but not fatally, given Raymond's evidence of intent. That evening, Grace called Derek and asked him to come to my house to discuss the finances. His eagerness was obvious even through the phone. When he arrived and saw Grace's face, his easy charm faltered for the first time. Baby, what's going on? Did your mom upset you about the money talk? Sit down, Derek, Grace said, her voice flat and unfamiliar even to me. We need to talk. With Raymond present, we laid it all out, the messages, the demand for $8 million, the recording Raymond had insisted I make of our earlier meeting for legal documentation. Derek tried denial first, then tried to turn Grace against me. Your mother's always resented me. She's using money to control you. Can't you see that? Stop, Grace said. I've read the texts, Derek. I know exactly what this was from the beginning. His mask dropped entirely.
Fine.
You want the truth? You think I was supposed to marry some nurse living paycheck to paycheck while her mom sits on $44 million doing nothing with it? That's insane. What's insane, Grace said, standing, is thinking a person's worth is measured by a bank balance. My father built everything he had with his hands and his integrity. You wouldn't know the first thing about either. Raymond laid out the path forward. Immediate separation, annulment proceedings on grounds of fraud, and a formal cease and desist regarding any future claim on the estate. Derek's fury rose as he realized it was over. You'll regret this, he snapped at me on his way out. Both of you. The only thing I regret, Grace said calmly, is not seeing it sooner. The annulment was finalized 7 weeks later. Grace insisted on paying back every dollar Derek had pushed her to spend, refusing my help. I need to clean up my own mess, Mom. Dad would expect that. In the months that followed, I watched my daughter rebuild, not just her finances, but her sense of self. We started a weekly tradition of sitting down together to talk openly about the estate, investments, and what kind of impact we wanted to make with it. Together, we set up a scholarship fund in Walter's name for kids from families like the one he grew up in, kids whose fathers drove someone else's trucks their whole lives and never got the chance to build something of their own. A year later, Grace started seeing someone new, a quiet high school science teacher named Sam, who drove a car with over 140,000 miles on it and brought homemade banana bread to our first dinner instead of a designer bottle of wine. He asked more questions about Walter's old dispatch office above the tire shop than about anything resembling money. He doesn't know about the inheritance yet, Grace told me. And I'm not telling him until I know without a doubt. It isn't why he's here. As for me, this whole ordeal taught me something I didn't expect to learn in my 60s. That silence, chosen carefully, isn't the same thing as dishonesty. Sometimes it's the last line of defense you have for the people you love most. Walter's money is still growing quietly, exactly the way he intended. But its real value was never in the number. It's in the scholarship fund bearing his name, in the daughter who found her footing again, and in the quiet certainty that when it mattered most, the truth was there, waiting, ready to protect us both. Have you ever had to keep a difficult secret to protect someone you love? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if this story meant something to you, please like and subscribe for more stories like this one. Thank you for listening, and I hope you find the wisdom to protect what matters most in your own life.